Hello folks, this is Mr. O'Brien and welcome to the video quiz on Reconstruction, era 1844 to 1877, and the amendments that happened during Reconstruction, 13, 14, and 15. So let's get started. Alright, what is Reconstruction? It was the 14-year period from 1865 to 1877-ish, when the U.S. government tried to reintroduce the South into the Union. You know, the war was over, half the country tried to secede, we need to bring them back. So we were trying to reconstruct them in a few ways. Number one, to bring them back into the Union. Number two, to make them loyal again. And number three, this whole racial thing that was going on. 4 million slaves were freed as a result of the war. So there had to be some type of reconstruction. Alright, now older history tells us it was a miserable failure, a dark time in our history, and in some ways it was. It was an unfinished revolution, as we learned. Eric Foner has called it. But the older history used to teach us, or the history that I was taught, used to teach us that it was not noble in its attempt. It was just a dark time in our history. It's more accurate nowadays to look at it as a noble attempt that failed and had to be fixed by the civil rights movement of the 20th century. Alright, so in short terms, it was the 14-year period where we were attempting to achieve national unification after the Civil War. So some key questions regarding Reconstruction. Who would control it? Would it be Congress? Would it be the President? How would the South be treated? The answer is very, very nicely. Alright, especially compared to other countries. Hush, live. So the first slide we're going to look at is Lincoln versus Congressional Reconstruction. No, don't. Alright, so Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction, which he announced during the war, was very favorable to the South. It was called the 10% plan because once 10% of a state swore loyalty to the Constitution, they were to be readmitted back into the Union. So his plan was about reconciliation, quick reconciliation. Alright, now Congress felt it was too lenient. So they proposed, and remember, Congress, I don't want to say they were controlled by radical Republicans, but abolitionists and radical Republicans who were, the radical Republicans were kind of the political wing of the abolitionists, or the abolitionist wing of the Republicans, let's put it that way. And they didn't really control Congress, but the Civil War and the eventual destruction of slavery kind of proved them right, so to speak. They were kind of running the show, sort of, a little bit. But here's what kind of happened. The radical Republicans would propose something during Reconstruction that would be radically egalitarian and racially equal. It was meant to create racial equality, and once it would go to the rest of Congress, the moderate Republicans would kind of water it down, and it would do less. Alright, so Congress passes this Wade-Davis bill because they thought that Lincoln's plan was too lenient on the South. So they wanted the 10% to become 50%. Once half plus one of the voters in any state pledge allegiance, they would be back in the Union. This was eventually pocket vetoed by Lincoln. What that means is, constitutionally, the president has to have 10 days to mull over anything put on his or her desk. And if he or she is not given the requisite 10 days, they can simply ignore it and it will go away. If they do have the 10 days and they ignore it, it doesn't go away, it becomes a law. But Congress gave him the bill with less than 10 days left of their session, and it didn't become law. So he pocket vetoed it, it went away. And he was kind of disingenuous in his response. He goes to the Congress, I kind of like your plan, Congress, but we've already got this one, the 10% plan. I think it's already started, we've already begun this one, we're going to stick with it. Alright, so, as we all know, a few days after they surrendered Appomattox, the Civil War isn't 100% over, but the major fighting is over. You still have pockets of planters refusing to give up their slaves, and pockets of rebels refusing to give up. But for the most part, it was kind of over. So Lincoln is killed right after that at the Ford Theater by Booth. Okay, and President Johnson takes over. Now, his Reconstruction plan was similar to Lincoln, almost identical to Lincoln's. 10% plan, same thing. Another requirement, and this is actually kind of surprising because Andrew Johnson is, and a lot of this is deserved, is viewed as one of the worst, if not the worst, president we've ever had. He's viewed as a horrible racist, and in many ways he was. But one of the requirements he put on the states to get back into the Union was, you've got to ratify the 13th Amendment before you get back in. Abolishing slavery. Surprising for Johnson. Horrible racist. All right. Also, Confederates were able to appeal to him for a pardon, and many did. I mean, Alexander Stephens, who was the VP of the Confederacy, winds up holding high office in Georgia until the 1880s. I think he was governor of Georgia until the 1880s, and he was VP of the Confederacy. He gave a speech saying the cornerstone of the Confederacy is that the white person is superior to the black person and to protect slavery. And he held high office after that. So Johnson's plan was even more lenient than Abe Lincoln. I mean, he was very happy to give out these appeals. He gave it a lot of appeals. They were lollipops. Now, to make a long story short, Johnson was disliked by the radical Republicans. Johnson was a Democrat from the South. Lincoln chose him as VP because he was a loyal Southerner who was not a secessionist. All right, he was very pro-white worker, pretty racist, quite racist. All right, so when he took over, he was anti-elite, he was pro-white worker, and he was anti-black. All right, Johnson was vehemently against land redistribution. Now, at the end of the Civil War, Sherman gave his famous 40 acres and a mule promise, but remember, that wasn't really out of any moral concern for the slaves and their well-being or any belief that they earned this land. He basically wanted them out of his hair to stop following him. So he said, I'll give you land if you just stop following me. He didn't really say that, but he thought that. So slaves were being given, not being given, they were being granted land after the war. And the radical Republicans wanted to make that a full-fledged plan of Reconstruction, to take land away from planters and not, I don't want to say give it to the slaves. The theory was they earned it. 250 years of slavery, they've earned that land. Johnson was very much against that. It didn't happen. The moderate Republicans wouldn't go for it either. Remember, the moderate Republicans wanted to keep their kind of trading relationships with the South. And to be sure, many southern states did do very well after the Civil War because there was a quick reconciliation and quick trading once again with the North, the quote moderate Republicans, so to speak. All right. Remember, the radical Republicans are the ones who were very strongly for racial egalitarianism, racial equality down south. Not so much the moderate Republicans. They kind of went along for the ride and, remember, would water down what the radicals wanted to do. The moderates were the majority in Congress. All right. So Johnson was very much against land redistribution. Got his way on that one. Also, Johnson vetoes the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. Congress passes this bill meant to protect the civil rights of African Americans. You couldn't discriminate based upon race, as the law went. Now, Johnson argued that this discriminated against white people. This veto was eventually overridden by Congress, 2/3 override of his veto. It wasn't the only veto to be overridden. He has the record for most overridden by Congress. And shortly after this, he was impeached by Congress because he allegedly violated the Tenure of Office Act, a meaningless thing. And he was found not guilty because he promised to behave, to not get in the way of congressional radical Reconstruction. Remember, Johnson wanted to kind of put down arms. Basically say, war's over, war powers are over. The radical Republicans, and that would have been in a sense abandoning the 4 million ex-slaves down south. The radical Republicans were very strongly in favor of keeping those war powers, not relinquishing them. Their belief was the war did not end at Appomattox. Remember, you still have pockets of slaveholders refusing to give up slaves. You have slaves that were still slaves after the Civil War because of this. All right? So, very different views of what Reconstruction should be between the president and between Congress. All right? Also, by the way, that Civil Rights Bill of 1866, remember, was watered down with subsequent legislation because it was Supreme Court found that the national government, remember, could not regulate private businesses. Right? Remember, that was overturned in the 1960s, mid-1960s, during the Civil Rights Movement. It stated the national government could regulate a private business. All right, so why did radical Reconstruction occur? We've already talked about that. Remember, Congress wanted to maintain their power, their war powers. There were two key congressmen, Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, the guy who got beaten up in the Senate by Brooks. All right, so in 1867 they passed the Reconstruction Act, and they take over. Congress takes over Reconstruction. All right, with land distribution being their primary goal, which didn't happen. All right, and to make it even worse, you have these former Confederate officials getting pardons from Johnson, running for federal office. For example, Stevens, who I talked about previously. CSA is the Confederate States of America. If you ever see that in a cartoon, that's what that means. Also, you begin to see black codes. All right, they were kind of precursors to the Jim Crow laws that pop up after Reconstruction. They were meant to limit the freedoms of blacks after the war. They tried to regulate the affairs of freed slaves. They tried to approximate conditions similar to that of slavery. There's a typo there. You can get arrested for unemployment, meaning, two typos. If a black person was unemployed and refused to sign a labor contract, and these labor contracts were eerily similar to being a slave back on the plantation. They were not exactly, but very similar. If you were unemployed and wouldn't sign a labor contract, you can be imprisoned for that. It was against the law, against the black code. So basically, white people held all the job, they were the employers. They refused to hire a black person unless they signed a labor contract. If they wouldn't sign the labor contract, they were put in jail. All right, so hey, life is great. All right, so if you look at this map down here, it basically shows that the South was broken up into 5 kind of military zones by Congress. It doesn't really matter what these zones were, but if you look at the map, it tells you on the left-hand side when the state was readmitted into the Union, on the right-hand side when it was, quote, redeemed, which was the code word, racially coded word, but redeemed meant when it was taken back for the white folk, when they were successful in pushing freed blacks out of the voting booth, out of running for office and stuff like that, when it was taken back from the alleged, and this was alleged, it wasn't true for the most part, corrupt and incompetent rule of black people down south. So if you look at Virginia, 1870 they were let back into the Union, but a year earlier they were redeemed. North Carolina was 1868, back in the Union 2 years later they were redeemed. By 1876, South Carolina, 8 years after they were let back into the Union. Georgia, it was 1870 in the Union. 1871, they were redeemed. Florida and Louisiana were the last to be redeemed in 1877 at the end of Reconstruction. Mississippi, 1876 was redeemed. All right, let's move on.